Hello Dalton Nation, this is Alden, and today we're going to discuss the accomplishments and failures of Donald Trump's presidency. Without further ado, here are President Trump's biggest accomplishments and failures as president, measured by their overall impact and taking into account the general response from Congress, the public, and the world. Accomplishment: reshaping the federal judiciary. President Trump has installed 3 Supreme Court justices and 220 judges overall to the federal bench, all for lifetime appointments. By December of 2019, President Trump nominees made up roughly 25% of all U.S. Circuit Court judges, according to analysis by the Washington Post. The courts get the final say in U.S. politics, setting precedents that can shape the country for years to come. Failure: Charlottesville and George Floyd. President Trump's response to the deadly neo-Nazi rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, remains one of the most controversial moments in his presidency. It was emblematic of Trump's struggle to bring the country together after tragedies and more generally. His response also typified his controversial record on race relations and white supremacy. Trump blamed many sides for the violence at the rally, which resulted in the death of a counter-protester, Heather Heyer. He later said there were very fine people on both sides. In the wake of the brutal death of George Floyd at the hands of Minneapolis police and nationwide protests that followed, President Trump also failed to rise to the occasion. The president had peaceful protesters tear-gassed near the White House so he could pose for a photo with a Bible at a nearby church. He's consistently demonized anti-racism demonstrators and controversially sent federal agents to the U.S. cities to squash unrest and intimidate the local population. President Trump has elevated conspiracy theorists and people who've threatened protesters with guns. Accomplishment: Space Force. And yeah, that's a real thing. In signing a $738 billion defense spending bill, President Trump officially established the 6th branch of the U.S. Armed Forces, the Space Force, which is the first new military service since the U.S. Air Force was created in 1947. Despite its name, the new branch has not been established to protect the planet from extraterrestrial threats, but it is tasked with protecting the U.S. military's assets in space. Many of the details surrounding the Space Force has still yet to be ironed out, and in many ways, the new branch is simply a more centralized version of the military missions in space that already exist from the Air Force, Army, and Navy. Failure: America's global image is, simply put, a mess. America's global image has declined significantly under President Trump, who has repeatedly insulted key U.S. allies while cozying up to dictators. The president's tendency to push important allies away and isolate the U.S., including by pulling out of landmark international agreements like the Paris Climate Accord, has had a serious impact. A survey of 32 countries that showed a median of 64% said that they do not have confidence in President Trump to do the right thing in world affairs, and in just 29% expressed confidence in the president. President Trump's handling of the coronavirus pandemic has also left the U.S. embarrassed on the world stage and created a void in global leadership that China has rushed to fill. Accomplishment: tax reform. 3 years into his presidency, President Trump's signature legislative achievement remains a Republican tax bill that made sweeping changes to the tax code, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. The law was the biggest overhaul to the nation's tax code in 3 decades, and the president pitched it as rocket fuel for the American economy. It permanently slashed the corporate tax rate to 21% from 35%, while also providing temporary benefits for individuals and their families. Critics argued it was a windfall for massive corporations at the expense of the middle class. Meanwhile, supporters of the tax cuts contended it would unleash an economic bonanza. Businesses would invest in their operations, they said, resulting in improved worker productivity and higher wages. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin said the law would juice the nation's gross domestic product to 3%, or more, as Trump said, 6%, and soon pay for itself and spread prosperity. The law has achieved none of the ambitious goals that the Republicans put forward, and there are scant signs they ever will. Failure: family separations and the death of migrant children. In 2016, President Trump campaigned on reducing undocumented immigration, pledging to take a hardline approach. He made good on that promise when coming into office. By doing so, he had been accused of human rights abuses and violating international law by the United Nations. The Trump administration's zero-tolerance policy on illegal border crossings led to the separations of at least 5,500 families and saw children placed in cages. To my knowledge, they are still struggling to find the parents of the 545 children who had been separated at the US-Mexico border. After widespread backlash, President Trump issued an executive order in June of 2018 to halt the family separations, and a federal judge ordered President Trump administration to reunite all those it had separated. But the fallout from the separations is ongoing. Accomplishment: First Step Act. President Trump signed the First Step Act into law in December of 2018, marking the first legislative victory in years for advocates seeking to reform the criminal justice system. The bill passed with overwhelming bipartisan support in Congress. It offers relatively modest changes to the federal prison system, but was praised as an important step toward by groups and activists seeking to end mass incarceration. The key aspects of the legislation are: it marked the first major legislative win in decades to address mass incarceration at the federal level. The bill overhauls certain federal sentencing laws, reducing mandatory minimum sentences for drug felonies and expanding early release programs. The bill also makes retroactive a 2010 federal sentencing law, reducing the sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine offenses. The bill also aims to lower reoffending by offering more rehabilitation and job training opportunities, and it includes provisions intended to treat prisoners humanely, banning the shackling of pregnant inmates, halting the use of solitary confinement for most juvenile inmates, and mandating that prisoners be placed in facilities within 500 miles of their families. Failure: COVID-19 pandemic. President Trump's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic will likely go down as one of the biggest disasters in US history. Hundreds of thousands of Americans have died and millions are still unemployed. The US has had more coronavirus cases than the populations of many countries, and more Americans have died from the virus than the number of US soldiers killed in combat in every war since 1945. President Trump has repeatedly downplayed the threat of the virus, contradicting top public health experts, flouting recommendations from advisors on how his own White House coronavirus task force. President Trump privately admitted to veteran reporter Bob Woodward on tape that he was deliberately misleading the public on the dangers of the virus in an effort to avoid inducing panic. Public health experts have cited President Trump's nonchalant approach to the virus and tendency to reject science as one of the primary factors in why the US emerged as an epicenter. President Trump has refused to accept responsibility for his failed response to the pandemic, blaming China instead. Accomplishment: defeating ISIS's caliphate and killing Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. ISIS shocked the world in 2014 when it took over a large swath of territory across Iraq and Syria and declared it a caliphate. The terrorist group's territorial holdings were the basis for its so-called caliphate and provided it with a major base of operations to conduct attacks across the world. After a 5-year effort led by the US, ISIS's caliphate was finally defeated in March of 2019. In late October of 2019, a US raid led to the death of ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Baghdadi was the world's most wanted terrorist to that point, and his death represented a major blow to the terrorist group. Failure: damaging democracy. President Trump has eroded the democratic norms in many ways during his tenure. He repeatedly attacked the media, leading UN experts to warn that Trump's rhetoric raised the risk of violence against journalists. He threatened to deploy combat troops to American cities over the objections of their elected leaders, and ordered illegal actions like demanding poll workers to stop counting ballots. President Trump's relentless dissemination of disinformation on an array of topics, particularly the electoral process, has led historians and experts on fascism to compare him to dictators like Benito Mussolini. Varieties of Democracy, a project that monitors the health of democracy across the world, in its 2020 report said the US has become more autocratic in the President Trump era. The United States, former vanguard of liberal democracy, has lost its way, a 2020 report said. adding that the US is the only country in North America suffering from substantial autocratization. The president's rhetoric has often been viewed as a source of encouragement by far extremist groups, and President Trump has frequently equivocated when asked to condemn such groups. Though multiple major news outlets have declared the President-elect Joe Biden the projected winner of the 2020 election, President Trump has refused to concede. President Trump is rejecting the results and has made baseless allegations of fraud. Even as world leaders have begun to congratulate Biden, a major sign of the president-elect's legitimacy, President Trump has continued to deny reality. President Trump's refusal to concede broke from a democratic tradition in the US that dates back to its earliest days when President John Adams lost the 1800 election and peacefully stepped aside for Thomas Jefferson, a member of another political party, to take over. The president is undermining the political system in the US and sowing doubt about the integrity of the country's elections. Every president prior to Trump allowed for a peaceful transition of power after they'd served 2 terms or lost an election.